Welcome back. We're discussing the situation in Syria. Let's get back to our panel. The humanitarian situation, of course, has been terrible in Syria for many years. We see these flashpoints, but the geopolitical situation is also very, very tense at the moment. US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has just basically been on a Middle East tour and was in Turkey, where US-Turkish relations are a straining point, but he trying to extenuate the positive in terms of Syria. Let's just take a listen, and then, Andrew, I'm going to pick up off the back.
Our two countries share the same objectives in Syria: the defeat of ISIS, Daesh, secure and stable zones, an independent and unified Syria.
Now, Andrew, that may have been correct a few months ago, but since the largely defeat of ISIL in Syria, we have seen this coalition fracture, haven't we? Just how bad is it getting, and who's fighting for what?
Very challenging for the United States. Secretary Tillerson was exactly right when he talked about those three shared interests between the U.S. and Turkey. What was not mentioned, and what is the key sticking point, is that the United States works with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is made up primarily of the People's Protection Units. That's a Syrian Kurdish group. That's the U.S. Partner on the ground in Syria, and that is the target of the Turkish military intervention. That is a very, very complex issue for the United States and Turkey to work out. And the U.S. and Turkey do not share the same objectives when it comes to that issue, which is the priority for Ankara. Also complicating the situation is the U.S., which has a deconfliction agreement with Russia in Syria, and there are talks at the senior level between the United States and Russian governments about Syria. President Trump, President Putin talk every so often about this, and there's some engagement, but there's also friction in the relationship. And of course, the United States has an adversarial relationship with Iran and has no relationship with the government of Syria. So the diplomatic levers that the United States has in Syria are indeed quite limited, especially because of the difficulty in the U.S.-Turkish relationship. That should be solid. That's a NATO ally. Yep. But right now there is a difference over the Syrian Kurdish groups, and until that difference is reconciled, the United States is going to find its maneuvering room in Syria will be quite limited.
Andrew, thanks for that very succinct analysis of a very complex problem. I'm going to go to you, Alex, in a minute, but I just want to play what the Turkish foreign minister said about this Kurdish situation, because obviously very different.
If the Syrian regime is entering here to cleanse the PKK and PYD, then there are no problems. However, if the regime comes in to defend the YPG, then nothing and nobody can stop us or the Turkish soldiers. This applies to Afrin, Manbij, as well as the east of the Euphrates.
So basically laying out the complicated Kurdish situation there, which obviously Kurds have been part of the fight against ISIL, as Andrew was saying, but also with their own interests in mind. And Ankara has been very worried about the PKK and the other Kurdish groups, which they've had a long-standing problem with. Where do things stand, and could we see an escalation here?
I think we can see an escalation. And can I just say, we've had very succinctly set out the problems in the US-Turkish relationship. There are, of course, also problems with the Russian-Turkish relationship. And for Russia, Turkey is absolutely central to a resolution of the Syrian crisis, because Turkey is the primary backer of many of these groups that form the Syrian opposition, with which Russia understands that there has to be a negotiation, and there are Turkish troops on the ground. So the Russians need the Turks to come to some kind of arrangement over Syria. But at the same time, we see a situation where the Turks have their fight with the Kurds, and the Kurds now seem to be tilting back towards the Syrian government. So it's a very complicated problem for Moscow. The Russians are going to try very hard, I think, to look for a solution of the Kurdish problem with the Turks so that they can move forward with the Turks on other questions in Syria.
Alex?
And we've been hearing recently about how the Russians have been helping Syrian troops enter Afrin and how, at the same time, President Putin and President Erdogan are talking to each other.
Alex, I was going to ask you about the Russian efforts in terms of diplomacy, because over the last few months we have seen largely an absence of US leadership when it comes to the wider civil war diplomatic effort. It's moved, people say, from Geneva to Sochi, but then Moscow still has all these thorny problems to address. Do they have different thinking? And given their alliance with the Syrian government, they were invited into Syria, as were Iran, can we find a way forward where Geneva has not?
I think one of the great problems that the Russians have is the complete breakdown of their relationship with the United States. I think that one of the reasons the Russians are working with Turkey is because their first choice, which was to sort out the problems with Syria, in Syria with the United States, were ultimately unsuccessful. And I think the Russians would actually like to re-engage the United States in Syria. I think this idea that has become fashionable, that there's a vacuum caused by US leadership in Syria and that the Russians are filling it, is not at all how this problem is understood in Moscow. Nonetheless, like the United States, the Russians will have to do the best they can. That means they are going to have to work with President Erdogan and with Turkey. And we see extensive negotiations going on between the Russians and the Turks. There's an attempt being made to set up another summit in Istanbul with the Turks and the Russians and the Iranian president also there. And hopefully, because when we talk about a humanitarian crisis across Syria, that is absolutely true. And the Russians, I should say, are very aware of this. I was in Moscow, and I heard people talk about it there. If there is going to be a resolution in Syria, we must hope that something good will come out of this negotiation in Istanbul, though the problems are multiplying.
Yeah. One problem that has got a lot of questions but not many answers, Bassam, is this potential clash that we saw between the US and potentially Russian mercenaries and then potentially Syrian troops involved over this very important gas field in Syria. It's flashpoints like this, sir, where you could see great power rivalry, overspilling and miscalculation. In your opinion, has Syria become a playground for proxy powers? And does that bode well for a Syria that can be put back together again with a full sovereignty?
But yes, openly and frankly, I have heard our colleagues who is talking. Now we are in a geopolitical game, a very big game. First of all, Eastern Ghouta, which we talked about, part of it, and this is one of the instruments. The United States openly talking about division of Syria. They are talking now about the southeast of Syria, the eastern part of Euphrates. And they want to control this corridor as they're saying with Israelis, that they don't want to leave Iran to have influence and to connect the corridor between Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, and Lebanon. This is one of the targets. The other target, this is a question of oil and gas. It seems to me, and a lot of information talking that there is a huge amount of gas and oil in this part of Syria. And I think this is one of the questions. The third, that all pipelines should pass through Syria, if it's from Iran or if it's from the Gulf. This is one of the questions and of the reasons of the war in Syria.
So, Touma, I'm going to give you the last word. We talk a lot about the geopolitics, who's involved, who's not involved. This, of course, has huge ramifications inside the United Nations Security Council, where Syria has been divided. There's regional divisions. But, of course, the humanitarian situation gets magnified on the ground because of the inability for sides to come together. Just how bad has it been? And what can we do in the next few days and coming months while the political solution is underway, where people are trying to find some sort of common ground?
Well, UNICEF is asking for the war on children inside Syria, wherever it is, to stop. That's what we're asking for. We are asking for what we call humanitarian access. So for us as humanitarian agencies to be able to deliver assistance to every child in need wherever they are in the country. And we're also asking for those fighting on the ground, an adult's war, to pause and think. Think about the children. Think about the children of Syria. And also think that if they continue to kill children day in, day out, they are killing the future of the country they're fighting in. They're killing the future of Syria.
On that last point, in Amman, Jordan, thank you very much, Touma, and also Damascus and Virginia and London. Really interesting discussion, although the humanitarian crisis, of course, continues. That's it for this edition of The Heap. The conversation does continue online. Join us on CGTN's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.